So today we heard from GM. This is exactly what we are seeing, what we're projecting. And specifically, they announced a $1.1 billion hit to profit in the second quarter.
Everything built with steel. You've seen the cost go up 30% in the U.S.
In recent years, President Donald Trump's aggressive trade policies have disrupted long-standing relationships between the U.S. and its trading partners, particularly Canada. Returning to office, Trump made clear that tariffs would serve as a cornerstone of his economic strategy, aimed at protecting American jobs and challenging the growing economic power of foreign nations. His approach, however, has been unpredictable and at times personal, with allies like Canada feeling the brunt of these decisions. The imposition of tariffs, especially on steel and aluminum, has escalated to a level that now threatens to undermine the very industries it was intended to protect. One of the most telling consequences of this tariff war has been the impact on General Motors and other American car manufacturers. GM, in particular, reported a significant financial hit, suffering a $1.1 billion loss in the second quarter of 2025, a direct result of rising steel prices. Automakers like GM and Stellantis are facing not just the physical cost of materials, but a tangled web of trade barriers that are wreaking havoc on their supply chains. Steel, aluminum, and auto parts are now subject to hefty duties as they cross the US-Canada-Mexico border multiple times, raising costs exponentially. These tariffs, initially designed to shield American manufacturers from unfair foreign competition, have instead inflated production costs, ultimately squeezing the very companies they were meant to protect. The economic fallout is not limited to American shores. In Canada, the government and industry leaders have adopted a strategy of resilience. Rather than appealing for tariff exemptions, Canada pivoted by revitalizing its domestic industries, particularly steel production. Premier Doug Ford of Ontario led the charge, backing a reindustrialization initiative that spanned everything from aluminum cans to I-beams. The Canadian federal government, under Prime Minister Mark Carney, supported this effort by fast-tracking investment approvals and launching targeted subsidies. The result has been an economic transformation, with Canada focusing not only on self-sufficiency, but also on exporting its steel and aluminum to Asia and Europe. Canada's shift in strategy goes beyond simple survival. It is a direct challenge to U.S. dominance in the North American auto market. The national push to reduce reliance on U.S. steel and the subsequent rise in Canada's steel production have begun to reshape the dynamics of the North American auto industry. In the face of tariffs, the Canadian government has used its newfound strength to pivot its steel capacity toward serving global markets, bypassing the United States entirely. As Canada's industrial capacity grows and its markets expand, it also signals a shift in the balance of power in North American trade. The nation is no longer simply an unwilling participant in the tariff standoff. It is leveraging its newfound strength to build stronger economic ties with non-U.S. partners. This transformation is already having ripple effects, creating a competitive advantage for Canada, while leaving U.S. manufacturers to deal with the consequences of Trump's tariffs. In the U.S., the damage is becoming more apparent. The ongoing trade war, characterized by shifting tariff figures and unpredictable policy changes, is not just hurting American automakers, but is also creating an atmosphere of confusion in the business community. The lack of consistency in U.S. trade policy has left many companies unsure of what to expect next. Supply chains are being disrupted, and American businesses, particularly in the auto sector, are now feeling the sting of the very tariffs they helped push for. For many manufacturers, the pain is already too great to ignore. As costs rise and profits shrink, it's clear that the long-term effects of Trump's tariff strategy are far from the victory his administration once envisioned. But it's not just the auto industry that's struggling under the weight of these tariffs. Steel prices in the U.S. have jumped by as much as 30% since March 2025, according to the American Iron and Steel Institute. This increase has raised production costs for automakers by thousands of dollars per vehicle, making it difficult for U.S. companies to remain competitive. Despite efforts to cushion the blow with temporary pricing incentives, American car manufacturers are still facing billions in losses. At the heart of this issue is the flawed logic of Trump's economic strategy. The aim was clear: to make America great again by forcing foreign nations to abide by American terms. Instead, the result has been an unpredictable trade environment that leaves American companies exposed to rising costs and disruptions. The economic damage is evident, but the long-term consequences could be even more dire. As the U.S. grapples with the effects of its trade policy, it faces mounting pressure from its allies who are increasingly looking elsewhere for economic partnerships. The fallout from Trump's tariffs is not just a trade issue, it's a geopolitical one. Countries like Canada, Japan, and the UK are no longer waiting around for the US to come to the table. They are diversifying their trade relationships, and in doing so, they are strengthening their positions on the global stage. In the next phase of this trade war, it is clear that the global balance of power is shifting. The US is no longer the unchallenged leader of the free market. Its closest allies are increasingly seeking alternatives, and China's growing influence on the world stage is becoming more pronounced. The global trade system that was once heavily tilted in favor of the United States is now being recalibrated, with Canada playing a crucial role in this transformation. As the trade war rages on, the question arises, has President Trump's tariff strategy backfired? The answer appears to be a resounding yes. While Trump has touted tariffs as a tool to break global trade dependencies and revitalize American manufacturing, the reality on the ground paints a much different picture. Instead of strengthening the U.S. economy, tariffs have triggered a series of unintended consequences that have exposed the vulnerabilities of American industries. The very trade relationships that Trump sought to reshape have been disrupted, and American businesses are now paying the price for this radical approach. Take, for instance, the auto industry. Initially, the U.S. auto sector was one of the main beneficiaries of Trump's promise to make America great again. The administration's aggressive tariff policies were supposed to protect American manufacturing jobs by targeting countries like China, Canada, and Mexico. However, the result has been far from favorable. As mentioned earlier, GM alone reported a $1.1 billion loss due to the tariffs on steel and aluminum, and Stellantis faced similar financial losses in the first half of 2025. These losses are a direct result of the rising costs of materials, which are becoming increasingly difficult for American manufacturers to absorb. The situation highlights a key flaw in Trump's trade policy: the assumption that imposing tariffs would automatically lead to increased domestic production. Instead, tariffs have caused the opposite effect. Companies, faced with rising costs and uncertain trade conditions, have been forced to reassess their strategies. Many have been left with little choice but to adjust their supply chains, leading to higher production costs and ultimately, lower profitability. But this isn't just a problem for U.S. automakers. The ripple effect of Trump's tariffs is being felt across industries, as companies are increasingly forced to absorb the financial burden of higher input costs. The U.S. steel industry, for example, has seen its prices soar by as much as 30% since the beginning of 2025, making it more expensive for American companies to produce a wide range of goods, from construction materials to consumer products. The broader economic impact is equally concerning. The Congressional Budget Office has warned that these rising production costs could contribute to higher consumer inflation in the second half of 2025, further straining the budgets of American families. What was once billed as a strategy to boost American jobs and bring manufacturing back to the U.S. is now emerging as a major driver of inflation. The cost of everyday goods is rising, and American consumers are feeling the pinch. On the other hand, Canada's response to these tariffs has been strikingly different. Instead of waiting passively for exemptions, Canada has embarked on a national effort to rebuild its industrial base, particularly in steel production. The Canadian government, led by Prime Minister Mark Carney, has rolled out targeted subsidies and streamlined investment processes to encourage domestic production. This push to reduce reliance on U.S. steel has not only helped fortify Canada's industrial resilience, but has also allowed the country to better position itself as a key player in global trade. While the U.S. is grappling with the negative consequences of its trade policies, Canada is seizing the opportunity to strengthen its own economy. By redirecting its steel capacity toward other markets, including Asia and Europe, Canada has diversified its trade relationships and reduced its dependency on U.S. markets. This shift has given Canada greater leverage in its dealings with the U.S. and has begun to reshape the broader North American trade landscape. In the midst of this economic upheaval, President Trump continues to press forward with his tariff agenda. But his strategy has now come under increasing scrutiny, as the economic toll of these policies becomes more apparent. The lack of consistency in U.S. trade messaging, combined with the mounting costs to American businesses, has created a climate of uncertainty that is undermining confidence in the Trump administration's ability to manage the global economy. Furthermore, the increasing isolation of the US on the global stage is becoming harder to ignore. Countries that were once staunch allies of the US are now re-evaluating their relationships. Japan, the UK, and other European nations have entered into trade deals with Canada, bypassing the US altogether. In fact, Canada's pivot to strengthening its trade relationships with non-US partners has not only reduced its dependence on American markets, but also enhanced its position as a regional leader in trade and industry. This shift toward diversification is a significant development. Canada's decision to realign its trade strategy has allowed it to build stronger ties with key global players, including China, the European Union, and Japan. Meanwhile, the US remains mired in trade disputes with its closest neighbors and allies. The disparity in approach between the US and Canada underscores the growing divergence in their economic priorities and highlights the vulnerability of the US economy as it becomes increasingly isolated in an interconnected world. But the trade war is far from over. Despite the mounting costs and increasing resistance from key sectors of the US economy, President Trump shows no signs of backing down. His approach to trade policy remains focused on securing what he perceives to be better deals for the US, even at the expense of strained relationships with traditional allies. Yet, as Canada's strategic pivot continues to gain momentum, the US is left to face the reality that its once dominant position in global trade is slipping away. The question now is whether the US can find a way to regain its standing, or if it will continue down a path of isolation, leaving the door wide open for other nations, including Canada, to step in and fill the void. As the world moves away from the U.S. aggressive trade stance, the consequences of President Trump's tariff policies are becoming undeniably clear. The goal of the tariffs, to strengthen American manufacturing and force trade partners to the negotiating table, has resulted in a fractured and weakened economic foundation for the U.S. Instead of positioning the country as a global leader, these trade wars have exposed just how much leverage the U.S. has already lost in an increasingly multipolar world. As countries like China, Canada, and even European nations position themselves outside of U.S. influence, the international community is beginning to question the reliability of the U.S. as a trade partner. China's rise as a global economic power is accelerating, and the U.S. seems to be playing catch-up. The economic strategy designed to punish China and other nations is now backfiring, as the U.S. finds itself increasingly isolated in the global market. With China producing two-thirds of the world's steel and electric vehicles, its influence continues to expand. While the U.S. is caught in a cycle of punitive tariffs, China has been leveraging its own economic strength to secure strategic trade agreements with nations across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. In fact, China's response to Trump's tariffs has been swift and decisive. In April 2025, China imposed retaliatory tariffs as high as 84% on U.S. goods, further escalating tensions between the two economic giants. At the same time, China has been bolstering its global trade network, deepening its investments in infrastructure projects through initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative. Over $1 trillion has been pledged to regions outside of U.S. influence, allowing China to carve out new economic relationships that bypass traditional U.S. dominance. Meanwhile, Canada, once seen as the U.S. most reliable trading partner, is no longer content to sit at the negotiating table waiting for relief from Trump's tariffs. Instead, Ottawa has pivoted by accelerating its trade efforts with other global powers. Canada is diversifying its energy exports, notably through its burgeoning liquefied natural gas trade with South Korea. By opening up new energy corridors to Asia, Canada is ensuring that it is no longer beholden to the whims of the U.S. government. Similarly, Canada's uranium exports to the European Union have surged, with France's EDF signing long-term contracts for Canadian uranium as part of its strategy to reduce reliance on Russian energy. These strategic moves are not only strengthening Canada's economic position but also reducing its dependency on U.S. markets. Despite the mounting tension, President Trump seems unwilling to back down from his America First agenda. The U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick recently stated that free trade with Canada is still possible despite the ongoing trade war. This sudden shift in tone, coming after months of escalating tariffs and antagonistic rhetoric, suggests that behind the scenes, the U.S. government may be beginning to recognize the extent of the damage caused by its unpredictable trade policies. Yet the question remains, is this a sign of genuine change or simply a tactic to save face in the midst of mounting economic pressure? One factor that may play a pivotal role in shifting the dynamics of this trade war is Canada's position in global energy markets. Canada's vast resources, particularly uranium, oil, and gas, are becoming increasingly critical to U.S. industry. With a growing demand for clean, constant, and carbon-free energy to power data centers for tech giants like Amazon, Google, and Microsoft, Canada's energy exports have taken on a new level of importance. These companies, which are heavily investing in AI and data infrastructure, rely on vast amounts of energy to power their operations. And as the U.S. struggles to revive its own uranium mining industry, Canada's critical role in supplying the U.S. with uranium becomes even more pronounced. The U.S. imports over 95% of its uranium, and while the Trump administration has sought to revive domestic production, it is still heavily reliant on Canadian uranium to meet its needs. The Cigar Lake mine in Saskatchewan, one of the largest producers of uranium in the world, has become a key supplier for the U.S. nuclear fuel cycle. Should Canada leverage this resource in trade negotiations, it could hold a critical bargaining chip in future talks with the U.S. At the same time, Canada is not just a supplier of uranium. Its other critical minerals, such as nickel, aluminum, and crude oil, are also vital to the U.S. economy, particularly in the age of electric vehicles and clean energy technologies. Ontario, for example, holds some of the most accessible reserves of high-grade nickel, an essential component for electric vehicle batteries and defense systems. The U.S. and Canada are so deeply intertwined in these sectors that any significant disruption to their trade relationship could have disastrous consequences for both sides. This interdependence has not been lost on Canada. By diversifying its energy exports and strengthening its trade relationships with non-U.S. partners, Canada is asserting itself as a global player in the energy and mineral markets. The rapid expansion of Canada's energy trade with Asia and Europe is not just a defensive maneuver in response to Trump's tariffs, it is a proactive strategy designed to reshape its economic future. Canada is no longer merely a bystander in the global trade system, it is positioning itself as a strategic alternative to U.S. dominance. As the global balance of power shifts, the U.S. is finding itself increasingly isolated, not just economically, but diplomatically as well. Trump's America First doctrine, which promised to restore the U.S. to its former glory, is now being seen as a policy of isolationism. Longtime allies, including European nations and Japan, are turning their backs on the U.S. in favor of more reliable trade partners. In response, Canada is quietly but steadily solidifying its place as a global economic leader, positioning itself as a crucial player in the future of energy, technology, and trade. In conclusion, the ongoing trade war between the U.S. and its neighbors, particularly Canada, has revealed the fragility of U.S. trade policy and the vulnerabilities of its economic strategy. While Trump's tariffs were designed to strengthen the U.S. economy, they have instead led to rising costs, disrupted supply chains, and an uncertain business environment. As Canada diversifies its trade relationships and strengthens its industrial base, it is positioning itself to take advantage of the shifting global landscape. Meanwhile, the U.S. finds itself facing the reality that power in the 21st century does not come from isolation and confrontation, but from cooperation and trust. As the world moves forward, it will be interesting to see whether the U.S. can adapt to the changing dynamics of global trade, or whether it will continue to face a future of declining influence and economic uncertainty. The answer to that question may depend on how quickly the U.S. realizes that the world is moving on, whether it is ready to catch up or be left behind.